Well, hello everyone. Thanks again for all who joined last week. We received great participation and definitely a lot of anticipation for today's session. For new attendees, welcome. My name is Danielle Munley and I'm a partner here at HTI. As a firm, we again wanted to create and offer a platform where we could bring together unbiased thought leaders in an interactive session to discuss some leadership in the time of COVID-19. Last week, we were educated on the fundamentals of the virus from a medical perspective with guest speaker Sindora Ganapathy, Deputy Director of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Thanks again to Sindora. This week, we will be transitioning into crisis management tactics. As you plan for the next phase in this COVID-19 environment, we are hopeful that today's session can spark some thoughts on ways to navigate this effectively as well as safely. Leaders, executives, board members, and investors will be faced with decisions on how we operate in this environment, affecting much more than business as usual. We will be addressing several topics, but focusing on a few key areas, including the role of a CEO in a crisis, corporate responsibility, adapting your business to a pandemic, and planning for post-pandemic. Before we dive in, this session will be roughly 1 hour, allotting some more time than last week for Q&A. We absolutely appreciate all the questions we received beforehand, but again, encourage you to use the Q&A at the bottom of the chat or screen for your chat. Please note this session is being recorded. With that, I'm happy to introduce our moderator, Mike Westcott, HTI operating partner and former global head of HR at National Grid, to take it from here.
Great, thanks Danielle. Welcome everybody, thank you for joining. And a big welcome to Tim, who joins us from Stavanger, Norway. I think I got that right, haven't I, Tim?
You have, Mike, yes.
Great. And what's it like over there at the moment? I saw something the last couple of days that a few of the restrictions are being lifted, is that right?
It's calmed down quite quickly here in Norway. What we've seen is, I think, fairly firm move by the government to control the population. And since then, the rate of infection has dwindled quite significantly. I think here in Stavanger, we had our last case of COVID detected, I think, about 8 days ago. So now kindergartens have reopened. The schools, some of them will reopen next week. There hasn't been any kind of absolute lockdown throughout the period, but the majority of people have been working from home, and for the time being that looks set to continue. So the sun is shining, which it doesn't usually at this time of year. It looks pretty good, to be quite honest.
That's great. So look, we'll come on to talk a lot more about that, particularly in terms of where we are now in the COVID-19 crisis and how we've got to respond to this as a business. But you know, we sent your bio out, and it's a kind of uniquely placed background to be with us today, because you've got a dual career. You've got the 20 years with the Gurkhas as an officer, living through Ebola, SARS, and the avian flu, and then obviously handling the crisis in your current role as a CEO with SKAGEN. But it'd be great for you, Tim, just to sort of paint out that picture a bit more for us and just give us your background and, you know, particularly what's relevant in that with the military, starting, I guess, with your military experience in terms of the crisis we face today.
Of course, Mike. And thank you very much, everybody, for dialing in. I hope I can make the next hour or so a good use of your time. As Mike said, I've spent a little bit over 2 decades commanding Her Majesty's Gurkhas. And serving in a variety of places, mostly away from Europe. During that period, very often we were deployed into areas where there was epidemics ongoing and infectious diseases all around us. So the idea of seeking to protect oneself and to operate in a more adverse environment is something that was quite familiar from fairly early in my military career. I operated in DRC in the Congo during various Ebola outbreaks. And of course, that is a quite extreme virus with an extremely high case fatality rate. I later was working on the staff during the SARS outbreak. That was back in 2002, 2003, and doing a lot of the planning in the event that SARS spread to Europe in any kind of meaningful way. and fortunately that did not. And clearly there were a great many lessons learned by those countries in Asia who were most affected by SARS. And I think we've seen that play out more lately in terms of some of the actions that they've taken in response to this pandemic. And then, of course, there was the avian flu, which was slightly different. Interestingly, the avian flu, I was then commanding my regiment in Asia Pacific in Brunei. The outbreak there was, it had a very high fertility rate of around 60%. So if you got it, the odds were not in your favor. But the thing about avian flu, fortunately, was that it had a fairly low contagion rate, and therefore you basically had to be in a relationship with a chicken farmer if you're going to catch it. What I would say, though, is that all of those various outbreaks and epidemics and pandemics created a, if you like, a memory bank of ideas and lessons. And I think we're seeing many of them play out, and the benefit, the hard-won benefit of those experiences are being seen at the moment in terms of how we respond to this particular pandemic.
I was going to pick you up on that, Tim, so if I may, just on that theme. Yeah. Do you think some of the countries which experienced those crises are now better equipped and better prepared to handle what we've got today? I mean, what were some of the lessons learned which have been brought forward?
I think there are local lessons and there are global lessons that have been learned from the various pandemics. And I think that this is an area where one has to be careful not to draw too many general lessons. Because of course, we all go into a situation, a crisis like this, with a different start point, a different level of resourcing, a different level of command and control, a different level of economic might. I think what SARS gave to the world was an understanding that if you move quickly, if you track what the population are doing, if you are actively seeking out the virus, then you can effect a pretty good control of it. I think what we got from Ebola, particularly the Ebola outbreak in Sierra Leone, of course, was CEPA. And that's the global platform for vaccine development. And I think that has been a particular advantage now, because clearly they are right at the forefront of coordinating the vaccine response that is currently ongoing. And of course, live testing began already, I think today, or was it yesterday, towards an effective vaccine. I think what's sad is that maybe we also missed a few points and failed to act accordingly. Interestingly, CEPA, they need around $2 billion to activate the platform fully to fight the virus. They've only got $1 billion of that so far, mostly from the likes of the Gates Foundation and Saudi Arabia, but nobody else is really coming forth with funding. So I think there are a lot of good procedural lessons that have been learned, and then technical ones, of course, in the whole area of pathogens and how to respond to seeking out a vaccine.
So when you look at the worldwide leadership response now to COVID-19, the role of the WHO, for example, and the various sort of leaders around the world, and you compare and contrast to what happened then, have we learned anything? Do you think, have we learned anything in terms of how we respond to this?
I think we always learn a little bit. And, very often we learn a lesson that was relevant to that particular outbreak, but not this. If we take the World Health Organization as an example, clearly this is a body that should have the opportunity to really galvanize support from all countries to fight something that is a threat to us all. But it's still a body that we fund to the level of a district hospital. How on earth can we expect a body that's meant to have a global purview to exercise its role effectively if we're giving it such a meager level of funding? So I think we may say the right thing, but then backing it up with money is where we tend to fall short. In terms of global leadership, clearly there are very many different political systems that are in place across the world, and one could argue for and against the success of different systems. I think at the moment it's very difficult to draw a clear conclusion as to exactly who has done what and how well. I don't think any of the figures at the moment are accurate. I know from prior experience, just trying to get accurate figures in theatre in the midst of an outbreak was very, very difficult. And we only really got the true picture a matter of weeks and months afterwards. So I think the idea that we've got a really accurate understanding of exactly what has happened in each and every country, I don't think that's correct. What I do see, though, is that in common with responding to any crisis, the role of leadership is to get busy, it's to get ahead of the issues, it's to be prepared to make decisions without all the facts available. And that's not easy for politicians nor for businessmen. And indeed, it's to be prepared to make mistakes, but to get over them quickly. And I think we've seen those countries who have been bold in their actions and prepared to take a position, even if it was then found to be wrong, and have then adjusted quickly. They are the countries that are responding better to what is unfolding before us.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, the speed of decision making in crises, we're so used to, aren't we, particularly in business, of having well, where's the analysis, the data? We just don't have that luxury at the moment.
And I think one of the issues, Mike, is that a lot of us make the mistake that we can take the leadership team or the management team that we currently have and simply apply that to a new problem. Well, we have leadership teams, management teams in business that are optimized for the business that we have. So when you're in a crisis situation, the very first thing you have to do is adjust your team accordingly. And very often the best way to do that is to separate out your day-to-day business and keep that management team focused on it. And then to create your pandemic response or your crisis response team who are going to be dedicated to that task, because there is a requirement to open up entirely new sources of data and information. There's expertise that's required, whether it's medical or hygiene, that you need in order to be able to make good decisions about how to protect your workforce, how to operate. And indeed, you may need other specialities that are not normally part of your business setup. So that kind of restructuring people need to do pretty sharpish at the beginning of a crisis and adjust accordingly.
And is that how it played out now? We're jumping forward really in terms of your CV, as it were, as your last few years as a CEO. And in dealing with this crisis as a CEO, it'd be great, I think, to give some examples on how personally you've had to deal with that with the fund management company you're running. But also, I guess you're in a lot of contact with CEOs of portfolio companies. So you might just see a little bit of the good, the bad and the ugly as well. So yeah, how given what you said about putting it in those categories, are you seeing that play out?
I think the fascinating thing now is that when we talk to the chief executives of our portfolio companies, it's pretty much a consistent reply from everybody, and that is, you tell me when this is going to end and I'll tell you what my business is going to look like. And I think that sense of uncertainty, I guess the safety is that we all feel a degree of uncertainty right now. Here in SKAGEN, we're obviously a fund manager based in Norway, but we have offices across 6 countries within Europe. We run global and emerging market equities. So we spend quite a lot of time looking out of the region. We have on the investment team somebody who ran the oil funds desk in China. So we had a very good network into China, and we started to see this developing picture in Wuhan and the development of what looked like a fairly serious outbreak. We started to put measures in place as a company. We formed a pandemic response team back in January. And we moved quite quickly to reduced working in the office. So we sent, in effect, non-essential personnel to work from home. We've got very good infrastructure here in Norway, and we were able to do that quite easily. And we sent our officers in metropolitan areas overseas home as well to operate from home. And then what we found was that living here in Stavanger, which is an oil town, we had if you like, the double whammy of half term and the holiday that everybody gets in Norway in the spring. And many people went to the Alps and they came back with COVID from Austria and Northern Italy. But it's a small community here, and that's the benefit sometimes of living in a smaller place. I think everybody in the city of 125,000 people knew who the first person was who was detected with COVID-19, and they knew within 24 hours. And then because we're an oil town, the health and safety that is pretty much the DNA of the energy companies kicked in, and everybody put measures in place, I think at least 10 days before the government. So the corporate world actually moved very fast on this, put protection measures in place, changed the working environment for people, and then the government came in with their measures pretty swiftly, including financial stimulus, which was very welcome.
And it's interesting you say that, because you have that sort of immediate crisis plan in phase, if you like, and then we kind of, as businesses, move into this, how the hell are we going to adapt to whatever this new normal is? And I'd be intrigued to get your sort of sense in how businesses do that and how a CEO does that. How do you adapt to this new normal when there is so much uncertainty surrounding it?
I think I had a little bit of a head start because obviously I had a pandemic playbook. I mean, I actually had a physical copy of our pandemic response plan from Brunei. I mean, with a red confidential on the outside of it. I'd stolen it. It was very naughty, so don't tell the British government.
You passed it on to
but that was, if you like, the playbook at the beginning. So that gave us a little bit of a head start, I think, over others here in Norway. I think the first thing that we recognized was that this is a long haul game. It's not something that's done as a single event. And a pandemic is a series of waves of infection. And then the only question is, how bad is the period of infection and what's the gap between waves of infection? And of course, we're still trying to determine that at the moment. We then needed to work out in the pre-infection phase, which in effect was where we started before the infection properly took hold in Norway to any degree. We needed to put in measures in place to protect individuals. So the focus in that pre-infection phase, where we weren't properly locked down to any degree by the government, there were more freedoms about people getting out and about, was to respond to that, to give everybody the right advice so that they didn't put themselves in harm's way inadvertently or unnecessarily. There was never any sense in this process that people were going to die, because of course the lethality is very low, unless unfortunately you're of the older generation or you have an underlying health condition, or you're just very unlucky. So we needed to put in place a set of measures about how we would use the office. We needed to if you like, bolster the infrastructure, the IT infrastructure. So we opened up a whole load of new capability that allowed everybody to work offline full time. We had to migrate our client process online. We're used to seeing clients face to face. We have 130,000 clients split across the various countries in which we work, both professional and non-professional. And we then had to, in the space of a working week, migrate the client process online. I think the good news was that we didn't have to persuade the clients. They were very happy to follow that. So we were able to put it in place, and they were waiting for it. And then it was a question really of then focusing, as we went into the infection phase, where there were more restrictions in place, adapting to the fact that most people were confined to home. And that is all about communication. And that's where the chief executive in particular's role is about internal and external communication. And it's not good enough to write or send updates. It's about being on video, it's doing it face to face, it's taking part in this kind of activity. And we've done an awful lot both towards the clients and internally. We had daily meetings to begin with, which we then started to relax as people got the hang of it. We needed to then help people make sense of working from home. We've run a series of seminars using external experts who deal with wellness type activities to help people to make sense of, what are the rules for working at home? How do you make it pleasurable for everybody? What are the do's and don'ts and so on? And really supporting that whole process. and also trying to spot where people were suffering. There's no doubt mental health is a key issue when you go into a period of restriction or restricted movement and life changes. And I think having that focus and being close enough to colleagues and employees to be able to detect when things weren't going well allowed us to then follow that up directly with them. So we're now in that process where we come out back into the pre-infection phase and we start again. Hopefully do it a bit better until the next wave of infection or we get the vaccine.
Yeah, and I think your point is very well made here. I think everybody's come into the dawning reality. It's not just going to be back to normal as we know it, because we don't have a vaccine. And if a vaccine is 12 to 18 months away, and there is a potential of a second wave, however steep or shallow that is, and people say maybe a third wave, we have to adapt the workplace to kind of a new reality. And there were a lot of questions posted before this call about, so what's that workplace going to look like? And how the hell are we going to adapt? And I guess adapt is the key word, because we're going to have to, if we go into another lockdown, then all the bets are off and we have to adapt to that. If we then come out of it, we have to adapt. So I'm just interested in your point, Tim, some of those changes you've talked about, you put in place. Do you see some of those as being lasting changes? And how do you see businesses able to adapt their workplace as we're coming out of this, the phase we're in? And what are some of those changes?
Definitely. Here I would suggest that we should tread quite carefully. I think that our businesses are all very different, and the particular circumstances of SKAGEN may be quite different to other people who have manufacturing businesses and so on. I think the principles that we've brought to the process, if we assume we're going to be in this for a while longer, the processes that we have brought have really been focused on making sure that we can protect people and that we've got resilience. So at no point are we intending to compel anybody to do anything. We're a human capital business, so we can't do that. We can't force people to do it. So we must give people the option to choose what they want to do. At the same time, we have to adjust the workplace to take into account whatever the government guidance is, and that's going to differ. And then it's about a lower density workplace. It's about decontamination. It's about those who have greater exposure to potential infection having to continue to work from home. It's about minimizing the use of public transport. In Germany now, if you want to go on public transport, you're going to have to mask up. I mean, that's their approach to it. So there are going to be a range of measures, if you like, which we will need for this next phase. In terms of the longer term, there is no doubt that this is going to, I think, be a seismic shift for many businesses. I think we went into 2020 seeing a number of trends in the market. For example, the sustainability trend, the E in ESG really went mainstream in 2019. Maybe this year it's the S in ESG, but make no mistake, that move towards a more sustainable way of operating and living, that is only going to accelerate. I think also there is the potential for an acceleration in the move towards AI and automation. Whether or not we see that delivering profound changes to manufacturing and production, I don't know. It could do. It could certainly happen faster than we've expected. I think also the way that countries have handled the outbreak and the breakdown in some of the global structures that we have come to know and love may mean that there's an element of reshoring, that global supply chains have to adjust to a slightly different way. People have noticed that they can't get what they want to do anymore, and they can't rely on other countries to deliver. That will be a very negative outcome, but I think it's quite possible. But I certainly think at a basic office level, I'm expecting to run a workforce that is much more flexible in terms of whether it's in the office or at home. I suspect we will probably downsize the size of the real estate that we occupy. I think we will continue to drive down the amount of traveling that we do. We want to be a sustainable investor. We're very active in that respect. And I think that will continue. And I also think that that capital flows are going to be shaped by some of the lessons that come out of what we're experiencing at the moment.
Mm. And if I can take us on to businesses planning, you know, we talk about the sort of the unknown, and I was looking at a couple of questions posted before the call. If I can just pull a couple out for you. Elizabeth Marino, VP at Hewlett Packard Africa, asked, look, you know, knowing all the uncertainties every leader is facing, how the hell do we sort of, she didn't use hell by the way, but how do we plan for C19 exit? And Peter Gibson, VP Energy Storage at LG Chem, what, you know, this is going, what's the most critical aspect of businesses that businesses frequently overlook when planning to resume to normal operations? So this, you know, as we look at, yeah, what's your thoughts on this planning cycle and how we do that most effectively?
I think if you look at what is your principal task in a pre-infection phase, i.e. when you're allowed to go back to work and things are starting to return to normality, and an infection phase, there is a difference here. And I think that when you are in the pre-infection phase where there is more freedom to do things, protection of the individual is the priority. So the measures that a company needs to take need to be focused on the workforce. How to protect the workforce. What do we need to do with our kind of business? How are our workers best protected? We still want to run the company. We still want to operate. We still want to produce. But what measures, and those measures are going to be a combination of the physical and the procedural. So what measures are we going to put in place to protect our workforce? And here people will need expert health advice. They'll need hygienists to come in and advise them. And that's this whole idea of creating new networks because this is an unfamiliar environment. Mm. I think when you go back into a period of restriction and lockdown, which we must assume will happen absent any new virus, then I think that then it's going to be much more about protection of the group and the resilience of operating the operating model. And have you done enough to make sure that you can operate in a more dispersed way, or are you simply going to be closing down the business? And how do you build sufficient financial resilience to be able to handle that? Mm. In terms of mistakes, I think the mistake that people always seem to make in times of crisis is to think that it's over when it isn't. And I think there is that sense of relief that people get from a seminal event like this, that they think, right, it's done. And of course, that relaxation and that release of tension and so on makes us all more vulnerable in a physiological way. But at the same time, our judgment then becomes a little bit, right, we're back to the business.
Yeah, exactly.
You know, how do we remake the money we didn't make in this past period? And that would be a mistake, because that will come back to bite you in the behind afterwards.
And Tim, you know, those businesses who can't afford to have people just continuing to work remotely, and when they do come back in, you know, they've got either factory facilities or people need to be in the office. You know, what advice would you give in terms of the CEO for that business in putting in place the appropriate measures to allow work to continue? Because the guidance we're going to get is going to be quite general, isn't it? And therefore, there's a lot of scope for CEOs to make the right calls, and a lot of pressure on them to balance the sort of the personal risk with the business risk.
I absolutely agree, and you know, this is why we as chief executives get paid more than other people. This is going to be a risk-reward calculation for every chief executive. And we can't rely on governments or the authorities to make these decisions for us. This is a decision we have to make for each and every one of our companies. And I think here it is the judgment and experience of being a senior leader that will allow you to assess the expert input that you need to determine if you have to go back to operations in a time of infection, how are you best going to do it to protect your people? And no matter what you do, you will have to lead by example. So the idea that you will put people back and you'll still be sat at home coming in by video link, that isn't going to wash. This is a time when people find out if they have a leader for a chief executive or a manager or somebody who just happens to be there because they're the founder or they happen to be good at something. And I think those leaders who distinguish themselves in periods like this will have a lot of followers afterwards, and those that don't may not. But I definitely think that this is about a risk calculation. And those who work in industries where health and safety is a natural part of their daily business, like here in Stavanger, the oil sector, they're quite used to making those kind of calculated decisions already. And they have a metric for it. They have a way of weighting the different parameters, and they have a decision support template that allows them to take calculated risk. And if people don't have that already for their business, then I suggest that you need to get it pretty sharpish.
Yeah. And I guess, you know, if you do put in measures, if you go slightly overboard, you can always take those measures out, or some of them. So erring on the side of caution would seem to be something which would be, I guess, a sensible thing to do, because it's difficult to put things in post the event once you've found something out.
I definitely think so. I think that there's a sort of profound effect from life experiences like this, where, you know, we really examine ourselves because we're experiencing something fundamentally different. And I think people who work in the uniformed services or the armed forces are quite used to this experience of having very often a traumatic experience. And of course, what happens afterwards when people come back from that particular situation or from that operation overseas is they make life decisions. And I think that's sometimes overlooked in processes or experiences like this. You will have many employees, many subordinates, some of your very best people, who at the end of all this will probably make a life decision. And if you want them to stay, then they need to have seen that you have been very focused on their needs and how they have felt and experienced this particular crisis.
Yeah.
So I do think that that's something that shouldn't be underestimated.
And staying on this, the key theme for all of this is a leadership. I was looking at some of the questions coming through as we're talking. There was a question here which I think sort of hits it nicely, which says, what are the three key leadership attributes that leaders must demonstrate to help their companies through the crisis, and why?
Okay.
That's putting you on the spot, isn't it? You can.
It certainly. I think I would distinguish three, if you like, qualities or behaviors of leadership that I think are critical in a crisis like this. I think the first is bravery. I think leaders have to be prepared to be brave. You have to take a stand. You have to make a decision, and it may not be the right one. And you have to be prepared to take it and stand by it. And when the facts change, you need to then adjust your decision. So I think the idea that we can wait for something to happen, you know, benign neglect, doing nothing, is not a course of action in a situation like this. So making a decision, even the wrong one, but delivering it well, can very often be a much better outcome than waiting to get the right decision. I think the second thing is, in a situation like this, leaders need to display competence. And that means educating yourself pretty quickly on the key parameters of the crisis that's in front of us. And that's what I've said about activating different information networks and data networks. I mean, one of the first things I did as this started to become clear was to reconnect with certain people in crisis management who are in intelligence and the military, to try and open up some of those pipes of information so that I could start to have a different feed compared to that which I need as the chief executive of a fund management company. And then I think the third area really speaks to the emotion that all employees have. And in a crisis, leaders have to have empathy. You know, we may not think that many of our people are going to get this terrible virus and indeed become seriously ill or even die from it. But that doesn't mean that they're not afraid of that. And certainly they're all afraid of their elderly relatives being infected in some way and potentially die. So we have to show empathy to that. And that is all about eliminating uncertainty and communicating. So communication is the third leadership behavior or quality that is absolutely critical. Communicating regularly, clearly, and often. And I think that what I did at the beginning was to start with, we have a weekly meeting anyway, where I always speak to the firm for 10 minutes on any issues that are in my in tray or any key work that's upcoming, or hand out any plaudits. But at the same time, we started to add an extra session to talk about the pandemic. We had our daily pandemic response meeting, and then every day I issued an update to all people in the firm from me as to exactly what the status was. And that looked at where was the virus, what was happening, what were governments doing in the various countries in which we operated, what was the status of all our people, what was the status of the operating system that we use, and then really a look at what planning, what measures were in place, what changes were being done, and so on and so forth. Mm. And to begin with, that was a daily report that got to everybody. And then we've now relaxed that down to just twice a week. We've sampled the organization. We use software to sample the organization anonymously on a weekly basis. People fill out a quick questionnaire, and then that is then consolidated to provide data against drivers. And we saw the morale and commitment of the organization spike upwards through the process, because people felt they were really being thought about, they were being given timely information, and where I was uncertain, I was very clear that I was uncertain, that I couldn't give an answer on it. And I think that communicating in a way that is truthful, that is accurate, but at the same time is optimistic, that is really important.
There's also, you know, as we move through this, Tim, and where, you know, there's a change in landscape of all sorts of stakeholders, and their expectations are, I guess, very different. So I just want to pull out a question I've got coming in from investors. So the question is, how do we see the investor landscape adapting to the new normal on performance expectations? And I like this bit, will they be as forgiving on decisions that do not focus on growth and market performance? So I think you're uniquely placed to answer this.
That's a tricky one. We're back on the whole sustainability piece. Yeah, is it return, or is it making the world a better place
as a result? Yeah.
Okay. If I deal with the landscape, I think the situation is still very unclear. If you look at, you know, the IMF are probably one of the more neutral observers or commentators in terms of their predictions. They're expecting a 12% reversal in global GDP in this quarter. But then they expect GDP returning back to more normative levels by the end of 2021. I think that is optimistic. But I'm a value investor, so I'm always bearish short term and I think bullish long term. But I do believe that what we're seeing from our clients is probably similar to what other people are experiencing. And that is that our retail footprint, which is about 100,000 people, primarily here in Norway and in Scandinavia, they have largely stayed in the market this time around. They didn't before in 2008, the last time we had really quite significant corrections. But they are sitting in the market at the moment. Whether they can stand the next step down that I certainly expect is coming, that I don't know. The institutional pipelines, what we are seeing is that these aren't stopping yet. And I think that they've moved right in terms of time, because the processes take longer. It takes longer for people to go through a process that they can no longer do face to face. But we haven't seen mandates that are in our pipelines being closed. They're still coming. They're just coming slightly more slowly. And I think if anything is going to happen now, we're going to see an ever greater drive towards more sustainable solutions. And I definitely think that this, there was a very good question I saw around from before the meeting, around this sort of renewal with the environment. If you look at the World Economic Forum radar of threats, they had pandemic in there. It was hidden away. They also had the oil shock hidden in there. But top right were all the threats from the environment and the consequences of how we currently live. And I think that is going to shape the investment world. what we've seen through this period of correction so far is that actually companies that are tagged with a sustainable tick, if you like, have done actually rather well. They've done better in many respects than those that haven't. So there is definitely some alpha in sustainability at the moment. And I think that if anything, there is a danger of something of a bubble, because I can only see more capital flowing into sustainable solutions, particularly from the public sector over the next months and indeed years. But I think the investment landscape, has it changed? Definitely. I mean, people will react to what they see the opportunities being right now. It's clearly not a good time to be in anything to do with leisure or travel, and that is going to take some time to recover. Arguably, travel probably needed cleaning out anyway. I think if we look at what's going to do well, you know, we're spending the equivalent of 8 Marshall plans in stimulus. That's just what's been announced so far. I mean, this is a staggering amount of money. And I think that's going to create a lot of volatility in the market. I think there's going to be some weird things happen. And I definitely think, you know, there's going to be some interesting infrastructure that's going to play out. I think tech will continue to be a very exciting place to be, particularly those that are going to benefit from the kind of trends that we're already seeing. I think inevitably pharma, but pharma is something of a specialist sport in my view. And then of course, I think any companies that have got good balance sheets, it's not a bad time to be in M&A or in private markets right now.
Yeah. And from a consumer perspective, you know, we've seen behaviors have to adapt because of the crisis we're in. There's this question, I guess, lurking out there, which says, are these shifts in our consumer behavior just a temporary blip and we just go back to as we were? Or will we see some lasting and permanent changes in consumer behavior?
I think that's a difficult question to call, to be honest, Mike. I've seen some interesting data from Sweden this past week. And obviously the Swedish experience has been touted as something different. It isn't quite as different as everybody might believe. But in Sweden, where there has been arguably a great more freedom than elsewhere, through the course of this period in March, they saw a 25% reduction in credit card spending. Now that's quite a big change. Now, is that going to endure? Well, I think an element of it's going to endure because of the potential unemployment that's going to follow now. And we're going to see quite a lot of businesses go to the wall. This is a cruel virus in that it affects most, because of its virulence, those who live in high density working environments and home environments, and the poor are being disproportionately affected by this. That is going to play out, I think, quite hard. But I think the consumers are going to move and spend on different things. I think people are going to adjust to some of the lessons that they've had from a period of confinement and think what matters most. It's not actually things, it's experiences, it's people. And I think that's probably going to create a short-term trend. Whether it endures, that I really don't know.
It's difficult to say. And staying on some of the big macro themes, you know, if you look at politically, if you look at the European Union, for example, hasn't covered itself in glory, people would say, in terms of the way it hasn't come together to respond to this. And some members like Italy are sort of questioning why they're still paying the bill for that. Now, this isn't a loaded question because the UK is coming out. But do you think institutions like that are under risk, and there'll be a sort of a shift in the landscape around you know, some of those big areas?
I fear so, yes. I think it's very unfortunate that the European Union have proved to be so flat-footed at the outbreak. As I said earlier, in times of crisis, that's when the leadership need to get busy and get ahead of the issue and not become victims of it. And I felt that the European Union stood back too much and let the individual nations get on with things. I'm heartened by their moves towards a more coordinated response now, and their efforts to produce a really quite substantial amount of funding and to recognize the differing situations between Northern and Southern Europe, and to in some way reflect that asymmetry in the way that this is handled. If they do that, then I think they may be able to recover themselves. But I think there are going to be questions about the World Health Organization. I think the European Union. I think, I've been very surprised that some of the alliances like NATO have been, has anyone ever said anything about NATO? I mean, tremendous command and control and capability available there, the mechanism to take a more regional look at how to respond to this, and I mean, absolutely nothing, silence. So I think people will question this. That, together with the challenge that we're going to see to the global supply chain as people do act to protect their supplies and reshore to some degree, I think that's going to create some negative trends.
Mm-hmm. And on the, some of the business model changes, you talk about the supply chain. I mean, I saw something that said it's not going to be just in time. They're going to be a sort of a just in case supply chain philosophy. Is there going to just be, people trying to sort of source much more locally and have that as reserves, or is that just going to be, again, a blip and die out over time, do you believe?
I think people will reflect on what has happened, but I suspect we will settle into more regional supply chains as vice the global supply chains of all, and I think of old, and I think that's probably quite regrettable. But I think we'll see more of a regional approach to things, and maybe some burden sharing in some areas. Of course, some commodities and so on have to be sourced from far afield. But I do think that people are going to look hard at their operating systems. They're going to look at their raw material needs, and they're going to they will make adjustment. I think one area that is going to really advance, which I've already mentioned, and that's automation. I think that is inevitable, and I think that we will see reshoring to more automated solutions within regions, and I think that was going to happen, but I think that's going to advance quite significantly. Yeah.
So if I may put you on the spot in terms of the shape of the recovery, assuming we're going to get a recovery, of course, at some stage, we've seen, is it going to be V, is it going to be W, is it going to be bathtub, and various other things. You've already hinted, I think, a bit, saying a huge amount of volatility, to expect a huge amount of volatility. So what would you bet on?
Well, I guess like many chief executives out in the audience, we use scenarios. So we're making assumptions about the future to inform the decisions and adjustments that we want to make now. We have three scenarios. It rather worried me that my best case scenario was the most likely scenario of a number of the larger American financial institutions, which made me think that either I had got it wrong or they had got it wrong. But I think in terms of what is the most likely, I think we are well beyond the idea of a V-shaped recovery. I think we are in that calm before the storm, because there does appear to have been some kind of decoupling between economic fundamentals and market pricing at the moment, given the amount of debt that the market is going to have to swallow. And it's either that or runaway inflation. So I do think we're beyond that V-shaped recovery already. Is it a W of sorts, or is it more of an L? I think I've even heard it described as an inverted square root sign. I'm not sure. I'm not an economist, and I'm not going to guess at it. I do think that it is going to be more drawn out than people expect, and I think it's going to take longer to get over this. If you look at the academic literature on the effects of pandemic, it certainly appears to be a longer term gain than the kind of effects that we get from a purely financial event. And I think that we should expect to see economic effects that are going to last several years, and potentially social effects that will last longer than that.
And I know we're running reasonably short of time, so I'm going to close this up in a few minutes, but I wanted to come back to leadership, Tim. So what have you learned personally over the last few months from leading an organization, and how will you take that forward?
I've learned how important it is, and I relearn this all the time, to listen. I've spent a lot of time talking and providing advice and guiding because I had a head start over other people because of my background. But I came to understand, and I saw some of the feedback, that I wasn't listening enough. I needed to hear exactly what it is that people were most concerned about. Not because I necessarily was going to change the decision that I'd made, but I needed to give them that reassurance that they had been heard. So I think I've had if you like, a reminder about the importance of listening. And sometimes, you know, as chief executives, we can get a little bit carried away and think that they're listening to us because they think that we're really clever. They're not. They're listening because they have to. And I think that it's a good reminder to everybody that we have to sound the organization, even though decisions need to be made quickly and fast. So I've learned a great deal, I think, about you know, responding to my colleagues perhaps better than I might have done.
Great, thank you, Tim. So I'm going to wrap it there because I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I hope I've covered most of the questions, at least the key themes which have been coming through. And again, thanks to Tim, because I know I've put you on the spot a number of times, those questions, but I think it's been, well, certainly a fascinating exploration into a number of areas, and I'm sure everybody's got something out of it. So thank you for your time, I really appreciate it. And I want to hand over to Andy, I think, is going to wrap up.
Yes, I need to unmute. Can you hear me, Mike?
Yeah. Great. Thanks, Andy.
Tim, thank you so much. That was fabulous. Really appreciate your time, and a lot of questions came in geared towards the information, and I hope it was as valuable to everybody else who's participating as it was for me, as I sat here and took probably 3 pages of notes. And actually a number of the things that you touched on are quite interesting for us at HTI to hear, and I know some of the investors and other CEOs participating, just on some of the key leadership attributes that you look for in crisis management, because certainly that transitions over to day-to-day leadership as well. So greatly appreciate your insights, and appreciate everybody else signing in and participating. And we will plan on, or we'll be doing a session to revisit another session in the upcoming weeks, and hope we can get everybody's continued participation and use this as a platform to again get information to all the people that have worked with us for years, and many of the new relationships that we have this be a platform and vehicle for some unbiased information. So I want to thank everybody for participating, and everybody stay safe and healthy.
Thank you very much indeed. Good evening.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks, Mike.